There we go. Yes, there is not a lectern or a microphone that is designed for very short women like myself. So we are going to gallop forward 350 years. So before I launch into it, I just want to make some really general remarks about the kind of country that the 15th Countess was living in. Because there are some really important changes, but there are also some really important similarities. As I was discussing with some of the pupils that are here today, industrialisation massively changed how Britain looked as a country, but also how it functioned. And that really matters for the Derbys, and it matters for, well, a number of reasons, but one particular reason that I want to flag now is that Liverpool and the surrounding areas are absolutely critical to both Britain's economic power in the 19th century, but also critically political power. So this area, the constituencies that surround Liverpool, if you could carry those constituencies, if you could win them, you would almost certainly win a majority and you would have the government. Okay, so it really, really matters. That's important because in the 19th century, and this is the second point I want to make, despite all the changes that industrialisation and urbanisation have wrought on the country, and we have seen the massive expansion of the middle classes, we have seen more working class men being able to vote, the aristocracy dominate government and they dominate Parliament. That is true for both the upper house, the House of Lords, which is obviously made up of the peers of the realm, but it is also true of the House of Commons. So for the majority of the 19th century, as was the case in the 18th, the 17th, the 16th, the 15th, the 14th and the 13th, both the Commons and the Lords are dominated by aristocratic interests. So it's either full of the sons of people that sit in the House of Lords or their very close associates. Okay, so the aristocracy hold an enormous amount of power and influence. The third thing I want to say is that, as we have heard, women were able to, particularly elite women, were able to carve out positions for themselves in societies that told them they were meant to be meek and mild and they weren't allowed to have a political voice. Nowhere is that more true than Victorian Britain. So in 19th century Britain, the rights of women is one of the defining debates of that century, or Queen Victoria's reign, in part because of Queen Victoria, but also for other reasons. What women were allowed to do and how they were allowed to do it was hotly contested. And that included whether or not they were allowed to have a political voice. And so as I talk through the life of the 15th Countess, I'd like you to remember for all of this period, women were not able to vote. For the majority of this period, they were not able to own their own property. And they had very few kind of divorce, marital, legal rights. So to all intents and purposes, women are still assumed constitutionally, legally, economically inferior. You know, women's work, if you want to know where the kind of battles about equal pay come from, it's because women's work in the 19th century was always pegged at the value of children's work. And the male wage was artificially inflated, even if in the factories they were doing very similar, indeed often, the same kinds of work. So I want you to bear that all in mind. I'm going to start in Christmas 1877. So on the 27th of December, so that's the day after Boxing Day, in 1877, a very, very tired visitor arrived at Knowsley Hall. His name was Count Peter Shuvalov, which is a great name. I'm not expecting you to remember these names. That's my job, not yours. This is a story. This is what historians love doing. We love telling arguments by making stories. It's great. Shuvalov, the very handsome and the very charming Russian ambassador, so the representative of the Russian government in London, arrived at this hall. And he had been on the road since Christmas Day morning. So he had left London on Christmas Day morning. As is always the way in the 19th century, the weather was absolutely awful. You watch any 19th century drama, the moment of particular peril, there will be a snowstorm, a windstorm, pouring rain, and someone will have gone out for a walk in the moors. We're sort of that vibes. It's snow that's the problem. The roads are frozen. It is really, really difficult to get from London to Knowsley, but Shuvalov does it. He arrives at the front door, and the Countess may be able to help us here, but I'm not quite sure where this would have been. As soon as the front door is opened, he is ushered inside, he's not announced, and he goes into the room that the Countess of Derby was using as her study. At which point, the Countess of Derby, Mary, takes a letter out of her locked desk. She was very fastidious about locking letters away, as was her husband, and shows Shuvalov an envelope. And it is, on the back of the envelope, you have the sender. In very neat print, it says Windsor Castle, London. Shuvalov reads the letter. We know all of this because it is recorded verbatim. And in little more than 2 paragraphs, it is a very, very short letter. Queen Victoria's chaplain, who is kind of if the Queen could not write letters like this, so she would use people in her court to do this kind of work, a man called the Dean of Windsor, revealed his reason for writing, that the Queen suspected that the Countess of Derby had leaked cabinet secrets to the Russian ambassador, so government secrets to the Russian ambassador, just as Britain and Russia are teetering on the edge of war. She is, in no subtle terms, accusing the Countess of treason, a theme that is apparently quite common among her ancestors. No. What was not said, but was really strongly implied, was that Mary, the Countess of Derby, and Shuvalov were more than just friends. It was an incredibly dramatic and serious accusation and would ultimately lead to her husband losing his position in the cabinet, and I will come back to that. But that episode has largely been forgotten by history, and indeed I discovered it when I was a student, an undergraduate student, in my second year of my degree, and I found a footnote. So footnotes are what historians do to prove that there is evidence behind the stories that they are telling. We can't just tell stories, there has to be evidence, right? And I found this footnote, and it's sort of detailed, and I thought, well, that's quite interesting. I'm reading a very dry book here about diplomatic history. Why have we not put that story in the main text? Because that's quite interesting, and the book I'm reading is not that exciting. And that speaks to the point that Anna was making earlier about how history is written, right? It is choices by historians. And very often, particularly in diplomatic history, women just don't exist up until the point you get female diplomats in the 20th century. And so I thought, well, this is quite interesting. And then I spent the next sort of 6 or 7 years researching her life. And what is particularly brilliant, and again, this speaks to other things we've heard, particularly from Vanessa, about the importance of archives, is that Mary, Countess of Derby, loved writing a letter. In this, she was not alone, okay? The 19th century, they love writing letters. The postal system is modernised, the Royal Mail is established, the postage stamp becomes, common usage, and you could send letters with incredible frequency. So if you are a member of the aristocracy, you could have 1, 2, or 3 collections a day. So it is a very instantaneous form of communication, right? We're not quite at Snapchat levels, but if you're in London, you're not far off it, right? And you would know if your letter had been read, right? So like on WhatsApp, you would know if someone had left your letter unread, right? And there is an astonishing amount of letters, about 7,000 to 8,000 letters that the Countess of Derby writes across her lifetime, which are scattered all around the country in local and private archives. And what they allowed me to do was to think about how you might think about the Countess of Derby, the 15th Countess of Derby, as a female politician in a world which apparently told women they weren't allowed to do very much. So who was she and where does she come from? Well, Mary was incredibly fortunate. She was born as the 5th child to George Sackville West the 5th Earl de la Ware, and his wife, Lady Elizabeth Sackville. By the time of her 11th birthday, she would have 6 brothers and 2 sisters, so it was a very big aristocratic family. And they had obviously entered the world incredibly well, not least because her mother had inherited a fortune from her father, the 3rd Duke of Dorset, while George, the dad, was incredibly well connected in the royal court, serving as Lord of the Bedchamber to both George III and George IV. It will be of no surprise then that Mary's childhood is quintessentially aristocratic. She spends her time moving around the various houses that her family own, between London and their country estates. Mary and her 2 sisters spend most of their days under her care of a governess. She doesn't receive a formal education, but she is incredibly well educated nonetheless. The sons all go off to boarding school, and there are some great, the siblings all hate each other. And there are some great letters in the archive when the brothers go away, and basically the sisters are like, thank God, like they can't tease us anymore. And then when they're due to come back for the holiday, they're like, what? No! We were enjoying it. But by the time she was a teenager, by the time she's about 12 or 13, we know that she is a ferocious reader. She spent a huge amount of time reading books. We also know that she is fluent in French and German. Her lessons, while she's a young girl, are often interrupted by tempting invitations to Kensington Palace, where she is often summoned to go and play with a young, Princess Victoria, Queen Victoria, who lives this kind of very lonely, isolated existence. And so her mother, the Duchess of Kent, just writes to aristocratic other mothers and just be like, you're coming on a play day, I need someone. Mary's teenage letters are fascinating because it is very clear that she has no intention of living a life in the shadows. She writes fiercely, intelligently and independently about politics, about religion, about literature and international affairs diplomacy. It's probably worth noting that her godfather is the Duke of Wellington, and there are about 1,500 letters between Mary and the Duke of Wellington. And she later remarks that she owes him everything that she has learnt. And those letters are really an attempt by the Duke to educate her. And you can see that, right? Like he will précis a kind of political event that's happening in Parliament or a diplomatic event. And then he will say, what do you think? And then she writes back and he says, have you thought about this? And they kind of have this kind of tit for tat. At the age of 18, Mary makes her debut in society. Now, if you're an 18-year-old in Victorian Britain and you come from an aristocratic family, making your debut in society is normally an incredibly exciting thing. It means you get to spend a huge amount of time and money on the latest fashions, and it means that your entire social calendar for what is known as the season is full of parties, trips, so we've got ballrooms that were absolutely packed, concerts, all sorts. I put the Derby on because I thought we should, mainstay of the season. It is an incredibly fun, gregarious time for young adults, but it does have a purpose, and its purpose is to be a marriage market, right? It's for members of the aristocracy to find suitable spouses. Mary takes a slightly different approach and decides that she's not that fussed in the fashion, really, and she's not that interested in any of this. So much to the frustration of both of her parents, she decides that she's not really going to commission any new outfits or buy anything, and instead she turns up to all of the events, as far as we can tell, in a very kind of plain, stiff black skirt with kind of a matching corseted top, but like nothing, no embellishments, nothing on it, and walking boots. And She would have her hair very, we'll see in a minute, there's a kind of portrait of her which will show this, but kind of very plainly done as well. So it is rare, although there is a portrait, and this will come up a bit later on, where she is in a tiara and a gown, but there is no evidence that she did that when she was 18. She seems completely sort of uninterested in anything the season might have to offer. And I mean, these are big social events, right? There'll be hundreds of people. They are lavish. If that is your thing, this is as good as it gets. And it's good fun. And the entire purpose of it is to get married. That is sort of the point, right? To introduce eligible aristocratic bachelors with aristocratic brides. It takes Mary almost 4 years to find her husband. And when she does, it's possibly a slightly unconventional choice for a young woman. So in April 1847, she marries this man here, who is the second Marquess of Salisbury. Now, some of you will have heard of the Salisbury family. They have a lineage which is not dissimilar to the Derbys, and indeed, again, mirrors the Derbys in terms of their kind of long-term political impact. The second Marquess was 33 years older than Mary, which I think is broadly a gap. We listen, we don't judge, but there's a difference. Not only that, he had 5 children by his first wife, all of whom were a very similar age to Mary. So Mary is marrying into a family where there are already 5 children, one of whom is the Lord Salisbury that people may have heard of, the third Marquess, who goes on to become Prime Minister. This is going to be important. If you remember one name, remember this one. The third Marquess goes on to become Prime Minister at the end of the 19th century. And he's also the origin of Bob's Your Uncle, which I don't have time for now. But Bob's Your Uncle comes from, because he was Robert Cecil, the Marquess of Salisbury. The second Marquess, not only we're grappling with a 33-year age gap, and we've also got she's also inherited 5 stepchildren. He is perhaps a slightly odd, eccentric man who spends almost all of his time at the Cecil's ancestral seat, Hatfield House in Hertfordshire. He is incredibly old-fashioned. So the way in which the household is organised, the hierarchy of the household, which has an impact on Mary's position in the household, it is all incredibly old-fashioned. But he does come with a substantial fortune and a kind of long lineage of political activity. So as soon as she's married, they spend most of their time at Hatfield House. In Hertfordshire, but also at their townhouse in Arlington Street in London, and sometime down in Dorset. Although it's not a conventional union, within the first 7 years of married life, Mary provides him 5 further children. So there are now 10 children, and I think it's fair to say it's a little bit complicated. Carries on being a little bit complicated in turn. And as was convention, once aristocratic women had provided children, they had a degree of flexibility about how they spent their time. And so Mary decided, really quite self-consciously, that she was going to become really active in politics. And I think here it really matters that the second Marquess of Salisbury, although he sits in the House of Lords, he has virtually no interest in parliamentary politics or government. It's just not his thing. He cares about the parish, he cares about local government, but he's not that engaged at Westminster. Mary is really helped in her desire to meddle, influence, discuss, however you might want to call it, Westminster politics by the railway, that other great Victorian invention. So in 1850, the London to York Railway opens, and it stops at Hatfield. If any of you are ever in Hertfordshire, I don't know where you would be, but if you were, it's a lovely part of the world, you will notice that the railway station for Hatfield is literally outside the gates of Hatfield House. So you come out of the station and you cross the road and you go into Hatfield House. They designed it that way. The second Marquis, when they were building the railway, helped design the route so the station was as close as possible to his house without disrupting his view. Because, you know. And it makes the journey between London and Hatfield much shorter, so you can begin to get there and back very quickly. And this really matters because Mary begins to use Hatfield House and the space that it provides as a way of establishing what was referred to as a political house. And what she would do is she would bring politicians up from London to talk about politics away from Westminster. And that is a role, as we've seen, that kind of meddling in politics behind the scenes, or in some cases, you know, very publicly, is something that has been passed down to the 19th century aristocratic women by their mothers, their grandmothers, their great-right. They have a really long heritage of doing this kind of stuff. Normally, though, by the 19th century, what aristocratic women do is they host their husband's friends and associates, right? So they're a hostess for their husband. The second Marquis doesn't want a hostess. I mean, he doesn't really want to talk to anyone. He doesn't want to party. He doesn't like socialising. So she just brings the people that she would quite like to talk to. And so she establishes Hatfield as a political house for her own ends. And what she begins to do is gather around herself men, and occasionally women, but men, who she thought she would like to talk to. So, and you begin to get all the big hitters of the 19th century. So you obviously have the Duke of Wellington, you have Lord Palmerston, you have the 14th Earl of Derby, and you have the 15th Earl of Derby, who was then Lord Stanley. You have Benjamin Disraeli, you have William Gladstone. You also have Charles Darwin and Thomas Carlyle. You have the British diplomats, you have the foreign diplomats, you have journalists. It is everybody. And here, she's also doing something very particular. So what used to happen is that you'd bring together men who all thought the same, right? So you would have a kind of Tory house, a conservative, what we would now call the Conservative Party. You would have a Conservative Party house, and you would have a Whig house, which for the purposes of today, I'm going to say turns into the Liberal Party, but it's more complicated than that. And if you write that when you're doing your A-level history, you'll get shouted at and you'll get a snarky remark, so I haven't told you that, right? But the Whigs with a W, not as in Whig, you get Whig houses. You very rarely got houses where people from both sides would come together. And this is what Mary does. And this really matters. So in the 1850s, the 1860s, the 1870s, when Mary is operating as this political figure, politics is really fractious, right? There are no formal political parties. They are emerging. It is very difficult for governments to get majorities in the House of Commons or the House of Lords to get their business through. You've got people crossing from one party to another. You've got parties forming factions. Does it sound a bit familiar? You've got parties forming factions in a bid to try and collapse governments. You've got other factions trying to prop up a government because they don't want their leader in, because they don't like their leader, and the whole thing is fraught. But what she's doing is bringing people together. And it is quite a heady combination, right? Hatfield is a very serious place to be. And indeed, it's so serious that the only reason why Disraeli sort of carries on going is because he can cope with the seriousness of it, because nobody talks to him at breakfast. So it's like, it's fine, I get a quiet breakfast, and then I can deal with the rest of it. And she earns a reputation of as being kind of the most effective and attentive political hostess of that mid-Victorian period. And we can begin to see how that has sort of real implications if we turn our attention to something called the Second Reform Act, which is kind of one of those mainstays of Victorian British legislation. You have the First Reform Act, which was called the Great Reform Act, because they didn't think there were going to be any other Reform Acts. So in 1832, they named this Reform Act the Great Reform Act, because they're like, that's it, we've done it. We don't need to call it the first because there ain't going to be any, like, we've nailed it. Lads, 1832, job done. And then it gradually realised that actually perhaps there are some problems and perhaps they need another one. And then you get the Second Reform Act in 1867, and it's a huge landmark piece of legislation. But it takes a very long time to get through Parliament. So Gladstone, as leader of the Liberal Party, tries first and fails, and his government falls. And then the 14th Earl, his government comes in with Disraeli in the Commons, and they manage to get it through. But they get it through because Mary sits with the Liberals and works out how they're going to pass it. So they amend it, they make amendments essentially that mean that the Liberals, or there is a rump of the Liberals that feel like they are able to vote with the Conservatives to get the Second Reform Act through. And I mean, it's a tremendous victory for the 14th Earl and Disraeli, and it essentially secures a Conservative majority almost until the end of the century, one way or another. It is worth noting through all of that, Mary works very closely with the 14th Earl's son, Lord Stanley, Lord Edward Stanley, who goes on to become the 15th Earl. He was described by his mother as a political monk, and he is refusing to get married. So he is one of the country's most eligible bachelors because he is the heir to the Derby peerage and also the Derby fortune. And he is considered the man who is going to take over from his father, right? So the 14th Earl is Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party, and people think that his son is the next one, right? So he's a massive figure politically and economically. That is worth bearing in mind. Shortly after the Second Reform Act is passed, Mary's first husband, Lord Salisbury, passes away. And Mary is now 43, and she finds herself in a really uncertain future because there is the animosity between Mary and the children from the first marriage. Mary is widowed and is in a fairly precarious situation. It is not clear where she is going to be allowed to live or where her income will come from. And indeed, it is quite it is quite a brutal change of circumstance. So almost as soon as the second Marquis has died, the third Marquis and his wife turn up at Hatfield House and say, that's it, it's ours. And they get rid of her things, they get rid of the horses, which causes a huge amount of emotional turmoil. There is everyone gets very preoccupied by the wine cellar. I think the wine cellar is like it's not really about the wine. You're reading these letters, you think it's not really about the wine, is it? But there's lots of arguments about that. And she's essentially homeless. Like, she doesn't really know what she's meant to do, but she's kind of homeless in that aristocratic way, so she travels around her friends' stately homes. She does that for a while, and she moves to Richmond, and she essentially disappears from public life. A few months after her husband dies, her father dies, and then her sister dies, and then her mother dies. So she has this kind of 18 months of just sort of unrelenting grief. But that all comes to an end quite suddenly. In May 1870, the evening newspapers announced, to almost everybody's surprise, that Mary was going to marry Edward Henry Stanley, who was now the 15th Earl of Derby. And they were married in July that year at the Chapel Royal in Windsor Castle. Shortly after, they arrived here, arriving at Edgehill Station, which I never know, but Edgehill Station, that way. And there are, I should have put them up, but they're not very good because they're woodcuts in newspapers. There are some brilliant pictures of what Edgehill Station looked like when the Derbys arrived. They erected a kind of arch that was covered in banners and flowers, and there's just huge crowds there. They get a salute of fog signals, there's huge cheering, and then they drive from the station to here. but as far as I can tell, the kind of route is lined by crowds of tenants, and Mary is frequently mobbed. So by the time she gets here, her dress has been torn to pieces because people have kind of been grabbing at them in their excitement. So there's a real feeling, I think, there of how the local community think about the 15th Earl and the Derby family in general. So the marriage was quite quick. It's quite quick to get remarried in 19th century Britain that quickly. Like they get really obsessed with death and kind of widowhood, and it becomes a kind of marker of various things. You only have to think of Queen Victoria in that context, right? You know, and this is after Prince Albert has died and Queen Victoria is in mourning. And so it, for some, including Queen Victoria, it is considered a bit quick. But in lots of other ways, it really wasn't. They had been very close friends and publicly for almost 20 years. They had first met during her first season when she's in her walking boots and her plain dress, which would have absolutely appealed to the 15th Earl. Like that was like right up his street. And of course, like he was one of the most eligible bachelors of his generation, and she was one of the most well-known political hostesses. So it was a real meeting of minds in lots of ways. And I think it's worth pointing out the 15th Earl he describes it as living at Hatfield House as if it's his own house while she's still married to the second Marquess. So there is obviously a real closeness of that relationship. They are a much happier couple than Mary and the second Marquess of Salisbury. They are very similar ages. They have very similar outlooks. Both are incredibly serious, earnest people who take the kind of duty of their class is kind of paramount in their minds at all times. They divide their time between here. They purchase a small cottage in the Kent countryside because sometimes London gets a bit much, and St James's Square in London. While family life at Hatfield was often fraught, here it was a very different kind of feeling. So Edward, the 15th Earl, welcomes Mary's 5 children by her first marriage as if they are his own. He seems to take a real kind of paternalistic role. They are, by this point, you know, kind of young adults, but you know, he sends them money at Christmas and their birthdays, and indeed many of them end up living here, and so life at Knowsley is very brilliantly and vividly described by the future 17th Earl, and he says that it's a very queer, that's his word, state of affairs when he visits the 15th Earl and Mary. So her 2 sons come and live with her. Her children don't have massive luck in life, right? They seem to really be struggling to find husbands and wives and just generally sort of keep on an even keel. So her 2 sons come, and they are described, and I quote, as huge fat creatures, and I think to give them something to do, they're put in charge of the horses, but then they just suddenly start buying horses randomly, and so then Derby goes to inspect the horses and discovers they're all of different sizes, which is a problem in the 19th century because you need horses to be of similar sizes to be able to do what they need to do. Arthur's wife is also brought here, and she's described as being unfortunate. I don't really know what that means, but it's not great, is it? It's not like a great, like, if you're ever described as unfortunate, I don't know. Anyway, so she never dines downstairs. She always eats upstairs, and I think this is her choice rather than the family's choice, but I think it adds to the sense of unfortunateness. And then the eldest daughter, Margaret, who's developed a really strong Christian belief, so there's a kind of real revival in evangelical belief in the Victorian period, and she builds herself a chapel on one of the top floors. It might even be in the bit that's no longer here, which the 15th Earl, not very politically correctly, describes as a howling shop, and I think he's just a bit bemused. I think he's like, I've got horses of all different sizes, I've got someone that's not eating downstairs, and now I've got a chapel. Anyway, and then the youngest daughter, Mary, also comes to live here because her husband, Lord Galloway, is actually treating her appallingly, but divorce is very difficult. So Lord Galloway is an alcoholic, he's never sober, and is described as an awful beast, which is, I think, incredibly euphemistic for what was happening. And you can see them all here. in the greenhouse. I mean, they all look cheery, don't they? In the way the Victorians do. So this is obviously Mary and the 15th Earl, and then these are, I mean, some of them look happier than others, but like, she's not thrilled with life, is she? Anyway, but they were quite keen on doing things like this, and the 15th Earl took a real pleasure in the family, and he would, every day on New Year's Day, he would weigh them all. I mean, he's got these amazing diaries, which we should talk about at a different time because they're great. And in the 1st of January, just everybody's weight. He doesn't make any comment about it, and then we just move on. But it must have been a thing. I think they all like, it was like a thing to do on New Year's Day. It was an activity. So if your Christmas holidays get a bit tense at home, there we go. But he was Lord Derby was a very awkward and peculiar character. He was very, very serious. And this made it quite tricky. And although he was assumed to be an up-and-coming politician, that earnestness often got him into trouble or made it difficult for him. There was a real sense that he lacked autonomy. And it was really acknowledged that Mary held power over her husband's political actions. And we can see this in several ways. So the first is in January 1874, the Conservative leader Benjamin Disraeli achieves what everyone thinks is the unthinkable. The Conservatives win a landslide victory. It is monumental. Everyone spends the weeks in Victorian Britain. Election results take a long time to come in, so you don't know. It's not like we don't have a swingometer. We're not all watching the BBC. It takes a while, but everyone's like, oh no, he's really done it. Huge landslide victory. For the first time in over 30 years, the Conservatives had won enough seats in a general election to form a government. And when Disraeli wants to form his cabinet, he goes to see the Countess of Derby, and they sit in her drawing room and they assign politicians to cabinet roles. And she does this brilliantly. So her husband becomes Foreign Secretary. That wasn't controversial. She persuades her stepson, Robert Salisbury, to become Secretary of State of India, and her close friend, the 4th Earl of Carnarvon, to become Secretary of State for the colonies. That is controversial. Both of those appointments are. Both of those men hated Disraeli. They resigned from his cabinet, his previous cabinet. And not only that, Lord Salisbury had made his name writing newspaper articles criticising Disraeli and saying this man is not fit to lead. And yet, here he is, serving in the cabinet. She now becomes, because her husband is Foreign Secretary, she is now a minister's lady. And this is brilliant. So she now gets an annual allowance from her husband's government salary for her wardrobe at a rate of £800. That is roughly worth £60,000. It is an astonishing amount of money, particularly for someone who's not that fussed about fashion. I sort of think it's a bit wasted. But part of the reason is because Mary now is expected to host lavish parties. This isn't in the Foreign Office, but it is, and this is hanging in your, isn't it? Yeah. But you can see the kind of just the visual difference, right, in the kind of expectation that now she is the Foreign Secretary's wife. And she would host a huge number of parties, particularly in London. It would be one grand gathering a month, so one big party a month. And this would be dinner for like 250 guests. This is not just like we're having 8 people round for dinner. 250 guests. We would often have drinks receptions for up to 1,000 people. So these are big, big gatherings that cost a huge amount of money. The second way you can begin to see her influence is in diplomacy and is in the event that I started with, which is what historians call the Great Eastern Crisis. We love calling things great as a kind of precursor, and it wasn't great. There was nothing great about it. It was very, which is a political crisis that erupts in the Ottoman Empire, which is now Turkey, Bulgaria, Greece, that kind of area. Between the Ottomans' desire for independence of those burgeoning nation states, the Russians, and it gradually pulls in British diplomacy. It is also an incredibly, as the Russians begin to fight the Ottomans and the Bulgarians get involved as well, it becomes a really polarised debate in Britain, and Gladstone kind of goes on a tour of the country and kind of whips up public opinion against the Russians. But Britain doesn't really want to go to war. Like, it's not a good thing to go to war. It just wants it to all calm down and for Russia to retreat. And in that, they use Mary Darby. And so Mary Darby is meeting regularly, 3 times a week, with the Russian ambassador. And they are hammering out various diplomatic protocols. And this happens over a period of about 2 years, 76 to 78. And eventually Queen Victoria and Disraeli gets really frustrated with the kind of neutral position that her husband, the 15th Earl, and others in the cabinet are holding, right? The cabinet is divided. Disraeli would love to go to war. Disraeli is jumping up and down. It's like, we need to do something. And he comes up with about 20 different schemes before he's like had his lunch. And everyone's like, I don't think invading Cyprus is going to help us, really. Anyway. So eventually Queen Victoria gets so sick of it, and that's why she accuses the Countess of Derby of leaking cabinet secrets, because she wants to weaken her husband. That whole episode breaks. It causes repercussions through the cabinet. The cabinet learn about it and are all like, oh my God, what are we going to do? Derby is going to have to resign. Derby resigns, at which point the Conservative chief whip turns around to Disraeli and says, you can't accept this resignation. If you accept the resignation, we will lose the next general election, because Liverpool and the surrounding area will vote with the Derbys. Eventually, Derby does go, and he also resigns from the Conservative Party, and then Mary convinces him to join the Liberal Party. And in 1880, there is another general election in which the Liberals win. One of the reasons they win is because Lady Derby drives round to the tenantry. She drives round to all of the tenantry throughout the constituency and talks to them and explains that Derby has changed allegiance. They can't vote for the Conservative Party. If they want to look after the Derby influence, they need to vote for the Liberal Party. It is a fairly controversial act, and she causes a riot in Croxteth. Right, so she's chased out of Croxteth because people get a bit cross, and they play Handel's The Death March. It's all incredibly emotive, and then there's somewhere else where she has to hide in the the top rooms of a pub, and there's a kind of mob outside, and it's all quite full on. She obviously, having helped with that, Derby then is appointed to the Colonial Office in Gladstone's government, so he has the rare kind of talent of being both a Disraeli cabinet minister and a Gladstone cabinet minister, and that is her last hurrah. She's relatively active in that government, but by about 1885, her sight has gone. She's got a very rare eye condition which manifests itself a bit like cataract, but it's not cataract, so there's not anything they can do about it. And so she essentially retreats from public life. When she dies in December 1900, so she's one of those Victorians that just carries on living forever, which is what I always used to say to my undergraduates. They'd be like, why are we still doing Gladstone? I was like, because he never dies. Because he always comes back. You think he's gone, and then he's like, no, hi lads, still here. She's one of those. But when she dies in 1900, that's it. There is no obituary. There is nothing. And so that is her life. Thank you very much.